Are there any senators wishing to vote or to change their vote? Seeing none on this vote, the yeas are 74, the nays are 21. The 60-vote threshold having been achieved, the nomination is confirmed.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
I now move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 552, the nomination of Paul Wofford, California, being the United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit.
Without objection. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination. Paul J. Wofford of California, be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit.
Yeah.
Mr. President, Madam President, I'm sorry. I ask, let's see, I have a cloture motion. I want that reported, please.
The clerk will report the motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Paul J. Wofford of California to be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent that reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum under Rule 22 be waived.
Without objection.
I now ask, Madam President, the Senate resume legislative session.
Without objection. The Senate resumes legislative session.
And what is the pending business?
The motion to proceed to S3187.
Thank you. I have a cloture motion on the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 400 as 3187, the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act, signed by 17 senators as follows: Reed of Nevada, Bingaman, Lieberman, Klobuchar, Murray, Beckidge, Blumenthal, Nelson of Nebraska, Leahy, Conrad, Johnson of South Dakota, Brown of Ohio, Cardin, Whitehouse, Kerry, Akaka, and Harkin.
I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum under Rule 22 be waived.
Without objection.
Madam President, this is the I've spoken before, Madam President, about the importance of the FDA bill. It's something we have to get done. Literally, people's lives depend on it. It addresses so many things with the FDA to make it a better organization, that we have to get this done. As I said before, if my Republican colleagues don't like the bill, offer an amendment. Offer an amendment. Take that out. Put something in if you don't like it. But I would hope that we don't have to go through voting on cloture on this Monday night. We should be legislating on this thing Monday. So I am stunned that, once again, on a motion to proceed, when there's been an agreement that we would proceed to this with relevant amendments, which everybody says that's what they want to do. It's not germane amendments, which is very narrow. It's relevant amendments. It gives people a lot of opportunity to change this legislation in many different ways. So I hope that we don't have to have that cloture vote Monday. I now ask unanimous consent the Foreign Relations Committee be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 1905, the Iran Threat Reduction Act, and the Senate proceed to its consideration that the Reed-Johnson shall be substitute amendment, which is the desk and is a text of calendar number 320, the Iran Sanctions Bill, as reported by the Banking Committee, be considered, that a Reed-Johnson shall be amendment, which is the desk, be agreed to. Substitute amendment is amendment be agreed to, that the bill as amended be read a third time passed. The motion to reconsider be laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate, and any statements related to this matter be placed in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
Is there objection?
Madam President, reserving the right to object. I would just note that this is a matter, and I appreciate the Majority Leader's desire to bring this to conclusion. It's been worked on now for quite some time. Unfortunately, the language that has just been presented to our side has not been widely shared. I haven't actually read it yet. Apparently it was brought over at 10:38 this morning, and when I came to the floor, it was described to me as described. It would be weaker than President Obama's policy, and given the fact that this is a matter on which Democrats and Republicans and the administration and the Senate have been in pretty close accord in dealing with the country of Iran and its nuclear ambitions. I would hope that we could ensure that the language is agreed to by all. There seems to be an important piece missing, and we certainly need the time to talk to folks to see why that's so, whether it could be put back in, or if it can't, then to be able to discuss it, because we certainly don't want something that's weaker than the administration's current policy. So I would hope that we could just have some time over the weekend and perhaps on Monday, when enough of the members can be apprised of what has actually been proposed here, and see if our colleagues on the other side would be willing to make the accommodation that we may need to have made here.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Reserving the right to object, I appreciate the leader's desire to get this done. I'd like to get it done, too. In fact, the original Iran sanction language was drafted in my office when I was in the other body. It's an issue I've been involved in a long time. This morning I've had a chance to look at it only within the last half hour. I suppose I could have been here at 10:38, but even 10:38 for an issue like this. And my view also is that it's not as strong as the President's policy. It's not as strong as any other resolution on this topic we've ever passed. And the question that would logically be asked would be, why not? Now, I'd like to think that that's an oversight in drafting, that we can work this out over the weekend and make this reflective of our national policy and the President's policy. But I'd be very concerned about moving to this language today, and would hope that we could work with the leader to have language that we could bring up as early as Monday and pass and send the message to the world that the United States Senate supports the stated policy of our government in this critical issue. Nobody wants Iran to be able to move forward and attain nuclear capacity, and I'd be very concerned about moving forward on this language as it currently appears to me to be stated.
Mr. President, is there an objection by either Senator Kyle or Senator?
Yes, Mr. President, for the reasons noted, I would hope we could work with our colleagues to fix the problem here, and until we do, I would have to object.
President,
objection is heard.
President, this is such an interesting conversation here on the floor this afternoon. I didn't have the papers. Now, I don't blame my friend from Arizona for not having the document. I don't blame my friend from Missouri for only having a half-hour look at this. This thing was given to the Republican leader yesterday in the midday, right? Now, Mr. President, the language they're objecting to was in the base bill. So unless they didn't read the base bill, we have a problem here. Now, they say they want to get it done. Strange way of showing they want to get it done. Mr. President, this has been a classic example of rope-a-dope. I try to be a patient man, and I have been very patient with my staff, working with Senator Kirk's staff, the minority leader's staff. I've tried to be as patient as I can be. But no, not right now. Mr. President, this is absolutely untoward what's happening here. We have tried to get this done every day. Oh, it's just, we got to do a little bit more. We have this agreement that was agreed to by all the parties. But, of course, now there's no agreement. I'm deeply disappointed that my Republican colleagues are preventing the Senate from passing additional critical sanctions against Iran. If they want to embarrass the President, this is a strange way to do it. 2 months ago, I came to the Senate floor and said we needed to pass these sanctions immediately. The fastest way forward was to pass the bipartisan bill sponsored by Senators Johnson and Shelby, which passed out of the Banking Committee unanimously. But Republicans then said no, as they're saying today. Republicans said they wanted to include ideas from Senator Kirk, Senator Powell, and wished to move forward with SRES 380 on containment. We heard their objections, and we've tried mightily to address them. With the goal of getting this bill passed and protecting our own national security and that of our ally Israel, this deal includes a bipartisan manager's package sponsored by Senators Shelby and Johnson with items of importance to Senators Menendez, Kirk, Paul, and Johnson. The American-Israel Public Affairs Committee has expressed strong support for this package to Senator McConnell and to me. In a letter today, AIPAC urged us to move forward with this package as quickly as possible. I ask unanimous consent that letter be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Mr. President, Democrats are ready to move forward and vote on an amended S-Res 380, the bipartisan Graham, Casey, Lieberman legislation. This amendment would put the Senate on record along with President Obama ruling out a policy of containment on Iran. Yet Republicans have objected again. We can't afford to delay these sanctions or slow them down any longer. On May 23rd, there's a round of international negotiations taking place with the Iranians on subjects related to this resolution we have. Democrats are ready to move forward. We're ready to pass both the Iran sanctions bill and the containment resolution now, not later, now. We can't afford any more delays. Sanctions are a key tool in our work to stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, threatening Israel, and jeopardizing the United States' national security. I am to the end of my patience, Mr. President. I usually never raise my voice with a senator. And I apologize to my friend from Arizona. I did a few minutes ago. It was just conversations between him and me. But I'm really upset about this. I feel that I've been jerked around. That's a pretty good understanding of language that people have, because we can never quite get there. The Republicans have kept us from moving forward for this for 2 months. We should have just done what Shelby and Johnson told us to. So I hope that something will happen in this in the near future. But I have to be honest with you, Mr. President, I don't have much faith that it will.
Mr. President.
I want the Republican leader to be heard.
Republican leader.
Do I have the floor now?
You do, sir.
I would say to my good friend, the majority leader, this is outrage I don't understand. My staff tells me we didn't receive the draft amendment until late last night, and this morning we were told it was final. Got the draft late last night. This morning we were told it was final. Now, look, we have debates around here about a lot of things, but one of the things that we have typically not been unable to reach an agreement on is the Iran issue. I don't know what the problem is here. A little communication ought to be able to bring us together behind something we can speak to unanimously, with a goal that we all have, I think, in this body, virtually everyone, which is to do everything we can to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear-armed country. So there's no reason in the world why we can't resolve whatever minor differences we have and move forward. We certainly don't want to take a step backward. And there are members on my side of the aisle who are concerned that the way the measure is currently crafted could actually be a step in the wrong direction. It could have been a drafting error. Well, what is wrong with sitting down on a bipartisan basis, looking at the language, making sure we get it right, and achieve the goal that I think virtually everyone in the room would like to achieve? Nothing, I think, to get angry about. A proper response would be to work out our differences and to go forward. Timeliness is an issue. We need to do this quickly. I think we all agree to that on both sides of the aisle. So I would just say to my friend, I don't think there's anything to be outraged about. Why don't we get to work, work out the differences, and pass the resolution?
Mr. President, my mind indicates that why is there any problem? We agree, just like student loans we agree, except they won't let us get on the bill to legislate on that bill. They think this Iran sanction thing is the great thing to do, but we can't do it. They say they need more communication. How about 2 months? How much more do you need? And I'm not going to get into getting Tom Hawkins in trouble, who worked for Senator McConnell, but he was given that mid-afternoon. Maybe he was busy and couldn't give it to the leader till later. That really doesn't matter. The point is we have tried and tried to get something done, and we can't get it done. Now, Mr. President, I think it is really too bad for this institution. I'm not outraged. I'm upset because I feel I've been used as a tool to try to adversely affect the president in some way. So I'm going to continue to keep an open mind on this, but I have to say that I'm terribly disappointed that it looks like we're going to arrive at May 23rd, and the Iranians, they have people around, they're watching this, and they're in town, they're laughing at us, laughing at us. We can't even come up with a simple resolution. It has no force of law. But really, well, I shouldn't say that. It does have some. But, I mean, they're laughing at us. Here's the United States Senate quibbling over a sentence that's been in this resolution since it was drafted.
Mr. President,
I'd be happy to yield to
Minority Leader.
you know, most people in America work 5 days a week. This is 1 o'clock on a Thursday. 1 o'clock on a Thursday. What is the problem here? We have broad bipartisan agreement, I think, about the approach we ought to take with regard to the Iran sanctions issue. The leaders on my side of the aisle are all standing here on the floor anxious to be involved in working out the language. And I would say to my friend, he said there's a sentence. Well, a sentence can sometimes change the entire meaning of something. How this is crafted is not irrelevant. So rather than us standing out here on the floor pointing fingers at each other, it's only 1 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, why don't we sit down and work out the differences, pass something we can mutually agree to, and try to make a difference for our country.
No matter how many times you say it, the language that we're told they're complaining about was in the initial bill. Now, Mr. President, I appreciate my friend saying, what is it? Most people work 5 days a week. I work more than 5 days a week. And I have been working the last 2 months trying to get this done. And every time we try to do it, the first few weeks the last few weeks, it's Senator Kirk. Senator Kirk is ill, I know that, and so I gave him every benefit of the doubt. If his staff is working with him, let's try to do what Senator Kirk thinks is a good idea, and if we can agree on it, we'll do it. Mr. President, we have been trying to get this done for a long time. It's not today at 1 o'clock. I've wanted to move forward on this a long time, but let's just give it another day. Let's just give it another day. Just another day or so will take care of this. But that isn't how it's worked. I would be happy to yield to my friend from New Jersey.
Thanks to the Majority Leader for
New Jersey.
I thank the Majority Leader for yielding, and I want to applaud you for asking to bring the legislation that passed unanimously out of the Banking Committee to the floor, because there's no one in this chamber who has been stronger on pursuing sanctions on Iran and trying to deter Iran from achieving nuclear weapons, and I'm on Senator Lieberman's resolution. But time is of the essence. We must send to the Iranians a clear message that you cannot just forestall negotiations and have negotiations thinking that you are buying time. We must show them that notwithstanding their intentions to buy time, there are consequences. The consequences of those sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran that are already moving forward and that the administration is fully seeking to enforce, and the continued perfecting sanctions that the Banking Committee sent out unanimously, that is incredibly important to send the Iranians a message. I look at what the legislation will do in part. It, in essence, closes loopholes that the Iranians have figured out. So it creates sanctions on the National Iranian Oil Company, on the National Iranian Tanker Company, making them agents of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and then imposes sanctions on financial institutions that would facilitate transactions with either entity. This is incredibly important. The Iranians are using this as a way to get around. It has sanctions on satellite companies that impose human rights sanctions on those companies that provide satellite services to the Iranian regime, but fail to prevent jamming by Iran of transmissions by others of the same satellite service company. It has sanctions on financial messaging services, and even though SWIFT, the largest of them, already pulled the plug on the Iranians, we don't want any other messaging service to fill in the void of what SWIFT created. We want to make sure that noose is as tight as possible.
Mr. President, could I interrupt my friend?
Sorry, Leader.
I'll yield to him just a second, but I want to make sure the record's clear. When I talked about having no force in law, that was the we were talking about the containment resolution, not
Yes.
not the resolution.
Yes.
But I also want to ask this question directly to my friend from New Jersey. What do you think the Iranians are doing watching this performance here today? How do you think they're feeling about what we're doing here today? Can't pass this resolution.
They're feeling that they originally felt that when we sent a 100-0 vote out of here, they said, oh, we're in trouble. Now they're saying to themselves, well, buying time seems to succeed. We cannot allow the Iranians to believe, as they head into these negotiations next week, that there's anything but having our foot on the head of the snake, and that we're going to continue to do that and drive every possible sanction and close every possible loophole, which is largely what the legislation that you were seeking to pass on the floor accomplishes. And that's why it passed unanimously out of the Banking Committee. So even as we talk about the resolution, there's no reason to stop the very essence of what would send a message to the Iranians that are going to hurt them in the economy, that are going to undermine their ability to continue in Iran as a government, that is going to be the very strongest set of sanctions we can levy from one government to another, for which we are leading and increasingly have the ability of having a multilateral effect, which is when sanctions take place the best. So I am besides myself. Now, look, were there amendments that I might want to offer? Of course. But I find it far more important to move now and to send this incredibly strong set of sanctions so that we can get passage and the Iranians get the message than to linger and ultimately have those negotiations take place and not send the messages. So I appreciate the majority leader's efforts. I applaud it. I certainly am for Senator Lieberman's resolution. I don't believe containment as a policy, but moving the set of sanctions to ensure that the Iranians don't do anything but come to the table and say, we're ready to follow a course of disarmament here in terms of their nuclear production is incredibly important. And, you know, sometimes things can wait. This is not one of those times in which waiting produces the desired result. On the contrary, it produces a negative result because they believe that we will not continue to pursue tightening the noose, closing every loophole, and being of purpose of one mind. And I hope we can achieve that before we leave here.
Majority Leader.
Before my friend leaves, I'd like to direct a question to him. Is it true, I say to my friend from Jersey, that you're a member of the Banking Committee?
Yes.
And it's true this resolution came from the Banking Committee?
I'm sorry?
The resolution, this came from
the
this
legislation.
This matter came from the Budget Committee. The matter about which we talk, the Iranian sanctions legislation, came from the Banking Committee. It was reported unanimously from that committee, isn't that right?
That is correct.
Now, during the last 2 months, I direct this question to my friend, you and your staff have been heavily involved in what's going on during the negotiations taking place. Is that fair?
That is correct.
And it's also, I asked my friend, Jessica Lewis, who is seated by me, who is my foreign policy advisor. It's true she worked for the senator from New Jersey. Is that true? Also working in that same area.
She did until the majority leader took her from her.
And it's true that we have worked over this period of time. Our staffs working with Republicans have worked so hard to try to get something done. And I would say to my friend, isn't true each time we're there, we're not there the next few minutes, the next day. It's taken forever, taken 2 months. Is that right?
We have thought various times that we'd be already on the floor and pass, and then there has always been an additional desire or objection. And I just think that what we have before us, especially in timing, doesn't mean that we can't continue to perfect as we move to the future, as we are doing in this legislation. But this legislation now, passed unanimously out of the committee, supported by the major advocates of those who share our vision that we cannot have a nuclear-powered Iran, and Iran with nuclear weapons believe that this is important to move now so that we can achieve that goal and send a message to the Iranians. So I think that time in this case is of the essence, and that's why I came to the floor to support your effort.
Senator from Connecticut.
I thank the chair. Mr. President, this is a classic moment, unfortunately too typical, where we all agree on the goal here. We want to pass another tier of sanctions against the Iranians to deter them from developing nuclear weapons. Our goal has been to get this done before the P5+1, 5 permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations plus Germany meets again with Iran in Baghdad this time, which is next Tuesday. I understand the frustration of the majority leader. First, no one has been more consistent and steadfast and, I think, sincere in their effort than the majority leader to have this body make very clear to everyone in the world, particularly the Iranians, that we're not going to accept them becoming a nuclear power, and we're prepared to use economic sanctions and, if necessary, certainly now the credible threat of force. I also know the majority leader has been pushed and pulled back and forth over the last several weeks to get to a point where we can get this done before May 23rd, so I understand his frustration at this moment. And I hear my Republican colleagues. I look at the language that they're concerned about. They're concerned that in listing the economic sanctions as one way that can be used to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons, and not listing the credible threat, the option of military force, as President Obama and others have said, that somehow we're sending a message of weakness. Frankly, my original hope was that the more important thing to do was to get this done and pass the Senate before next Tuesday when all the parties come to Baghdad. But the difference here is not only small, it's non-existent. I mean, we all agree that we ought to try the sanctions, we ought to make them tough, they ought not to be watered down before the Iranians really agree to stop their nuclear weapons program, and we all agree that we have to have the credible threat of force being used against the Iranian nuclear program if there's any real hope of the sanctions working. So I hope, I know the majority leader has to leave the floor, but ideally I wish we could agree on that sentence and get it done today and get it passed by consent. If we can't, I hope we can do it by Monday, so we do send a message of unity, which we have, but the words, the procedures, the mood is standing in the way of us sending a unified message from the United States Senate to the rest of the world, and particularly to the Islamic Republic of Iran and Tehran, that we mean business. Right now, we're not speaking with one voice. So I appeal to my colleagues, let's step back, let's take a breath. Can we do it this afternoon? Maybe. I hope so. If we can't, let's get it done over the weekend and adopt it by Monday. I yield the floor.
Senator from South Carolina.
I would just like to echo what my friend from Connecticut, Senator Lieberman, said. I'd like to get this done so we all could vote for it and send the appropriate signal. It's not so much that we act before Tuesday, even though that's important, that we let the Iranians and the world know what we mean when we speak. I hope they're watching it, Tehran. I don't know if you get C-SPAN or not. They'll probably find it odd that Lindsey Graham is now associated with being easy on Iran. Trust me, I'm not. Senator Menendez has been a champion, along with Senator Kirk, of creating legislation that we could all buy into 100-0. We can't agree that, you should take Sunday off 100-0. What they achieved was remarkable. To Senator Reid, you've been pulled and torn. I appreciate it. I enjoy working with you. You think maybe somebody's doing you wrong. We're not. You got to ask the question, why would Senator Graham be on the floor concerned about what we say if I genuinely did not believe we're making a mistake? I don't want to embarrass the President. Mr. President, keep it up with Iran. I hope sanctions work. And if you need to use military force to protect this nation, if sanctions fail, I will be your strongest advocate. But a couple things have been said that need to be corrected. The manager's amendment is not what was in the base bill, or we wouldn't need a manager's amendment. Section 102 in the base bill is like 3 paragraphs. Section 102 here is like 10 pages. The bottom line for me is that this section was added in the manager's amendment that didn't exist in the base bill. Nothing in this act or this amendment or the amendments made by this act shall be construed as a declaration of war or an authorization of the use of force against Iran or Syria. That wasn't in the base bill. Where the hell did that come from? This is not a declaration of war. But when you put this sentence in there and the new amendment doesn't say one thing about the use of force to control the Iranian behavior, the President's own words are all options on the table. The reason I'm exercised is that we're now producing a product that backs away from where the President has been regarding all options on the table, and we end the new manager's package with a statement, nothing here authorizes the use of force against Iran or Syria. It's all about sanctions in the bill, and the only time we mention force is to say we won't do it or we won't authorize it. All I'm asking is what Senator Lieberman said. These sanctions are great. I hope they will change Iranian behavior. They haven't yet, and I don't think they ever will, but I'm willing to go down this road. All I'm asking is that when you include in the legislation ideas or concepts that will change Iranian behavior, that we put on the table all options are on the table in the bill, because this will be the first piece of legislation where that is ominously omitted. And to end the whole concept of what we're trying to do with a declarative statement, this is not a declaration of war or the use of force against Iran or Syria, would make the Iranians believe, quite frankly, we're all about sanctions and that is it. I'm all for sanctions, but if you're listening to Ron, I want more on the table to make you change your behavior. This summer is going to be tough for the world. The Iranians talk and enrich. There's nothing I've seen credible to make me believe they're not pursuing a nuclear weapons capability. I hope the talks next Tuesday will change their behavior. I appreciate what Senator Menendez has done, along with his colleagues on the Banking Committee, to give this President more tools to make them even tougher than they are today. But the worst thing we could do before next Tuesday is leave any doubt to anybody who's watching this debate that there's more on the table than just sanctions. That on the table, and we hope to God we never use it, is it to stop our Iranian nuclear program by the use of force if that is required. And that's all I want us to say. And I hope we never get there. And this last statement, I agree with, that I'm not asking for a declaration of war against Iran or Syria, but I will not vote for a document at this critical time in our nation's history. The existential threat we're facing from a rogue regime who denies the existence of Israel to exist, who has killed over 2,000 Americans in Iraq, who has been a proxy for evil throughout the planet, whose own president doesn't believe the Holocaust existed. To my friends at AIPAC, I agree with you most of the time, but if you think this is the right answer, I couldn't agree with you more. Add one simple line, that in addition to all the fine work of the Banking Committee and my dear friend Senator Menendez, we in the Senate recognize what the President has been saying for months, that military force is also an option.
Senator from Tennessee.
First of all, we have two things on the floor that are being discussed right now, and I know this is confusing probably to people in Tehran. But the fact is that I agree that Senator Menendez and Kirk have done a great job. I'm on the Banking Committee. We voted this out unanimously, and I do hope with this manager's package being added that we will work out the details here. My sense is, by the way, we'll do that. My sense is we'll do that by the end of the day. So on the sanctions bill, I hope it goes forward. And I'd like to move now to something called a resolution. And if you saw a minute ago, Senator Reid talked about something not having the force of law. We're not talking about the sanctions bill. It has the force of law and hopefully will become law soon. What doesn't have the force of law is Senate Res 380. And I'd like to have a little colloquy, if I could, Mr. President, with the senator from Connecticut and the senator from South Carolina, because sometimes...
Without objection.
Sometimes what happens around here, it happened in Libya. We passed a resolution at 9 o'clock one night by unanimous consent, and somebody over at the State Department decided that that was an authorization for force, and that was not the intent of that resolution. And what I'd like to clear up, and again, we're talking now about the resolution, not about the sanctions bill, but I'd like to have a colloquy since these are the co-sponsors of Senate Res 380. And there's Clause 6 in here that says, strongly supports United States policy to prevent the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability. There are some wise people over at the State Department that could use that statement as a declaration of war, and I think they acknowledge that. I don't think the authors of this resolution want that to be the case, and so I'd just like to clarify that in the resolution, not in the sanctions bill, none of the language included in Senate Res 380 may be interpreted as congressional support for military operations in Iran. I hope that, should the administration decide kinetic activities are the only avenue available, and we all hope that doesn't happen, but believe it can, that kinetic activities are the only avenue available to achieve our policy objectives, they will come to Congress for authorization. This is not intended as an authorization of war. I think these two co-sponsors of the resolution agree, and if the President does want to go to war with Iran, it is his responsibility to come to Congress. Is that the agreement, gentlemen?
Connecticut.
Mr. President, I'm pleased to respond to my friend from Tennessee, and I'm actually very glad that he raised the question because I know there's at least one other member of the Senate that has similar concerns. The interpretation of my friend from Tennessee of our intention in this resolution is exactly right, which is that there is nothing in this resolution that is intended to be an authorization of the use of military force in Iran by the President or government military of the United States of America. This resolution's main focus is to essentially back up with a congressional statement the position that President Obama has articulated that no matter what happens, containment of a nuclear Iran is not an acceptable policy from the point of view of the security of the United States, that our policy is to prevent the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. And that's exactly why Clause 6 was put in there, to say that we do not accept containment, that our policy is prevention of the Islamic Republic of Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. But I want to be really clear that there's nothing in that language that Senator Graham or I, Senator Casey, see as the authorization of the use of military force. If at any point circumstances in Iran require, in the judgment of the Commander-in-Chief, military action, then I expect, particularly if it lasts a period of time that would bring it within the purview of the war powers understandings, that the President would come to Congress seeking explicit authorization for the use of military force. This resolution supports the negotiations going on now between the P5+1 and Iran. It expresses our hope that they succeed so that the option of military force is not necessary. It's very significant in that it essentially says, and I'll paraphrase it, that we ought not to dial down the economic sanctions against Iran just because they've come to the table and maybe accepted one part of what we want them to do. They've really got to show that they've made a commitment for a verifiable end of their nuclear weapons program before we lift the economic sanctions. That's the real goal, and if they don't, then they're going to face our policy of prevention, not containment. But this is not the authorization of the use of military force. I thank my friend from Tennessee for raising the question, giving us the opportunity to respond, and I hope it reassures anyone else in the Senate who may have had that same concern. With that, I yield to my friend from South Carolina.
Mr. President, to Senator Corker, very good question, and I will answer directly just like Senator Lieberman. The resolution is not designed to authorize the use of force where anybody in the State Department and the administration could say, we've got the green light to go into Iran from Congress. That's not what we're intending to do. We're intending to echo a policy statement made by President Obama that the policy of the United States will be, if you're listening in Tehran, not to contain you if you obtain nuclear capability. And I want to lodge an objection to my own resolution by my colleague, Rand Paul, who could not be here, so I'm going to object on his behalf. He wants to strike two provisions of the resolution. I don't think we can get there from here. But to Senator Corker, if you wanted to add a line into this resolution, this is not authorization to use force, I would gladly do that so that nobody could mistake it. But here's what Senator Paul suggested to me. What if they get, we don't want to contain them, that's our policy, but what if we wake up one day and they explode a bomb out in the desert and they've already got it? What would we do then? Does that mean we have to go after their nuclear program, or will we try to contain them? It means, from my point of view, we should go after their nuclear program. We just have a difference. If the Iranians think they can sneak through and get a nuclear weapon, then we're going to contain them. It doesn't work that way. They need to know that their regime's survival is at stake if they go down this road. If by some accident of our intelligence being wrong, if that could be even conceivable, which I think it could be given this closed environment, we're not going to allow nuclear-capable Iran, period. But to this resolution, it is not an authorization to use force. To Senator Menendez, this last statement, which wasn't in the base bill, I don't object to that. This is not a declaration of war, your bill against. I don't know why somebody added Syria. We're not talking about Syria. There's some people out there who are wanting to limit the United States' ability to sometimes defend itself. I just want to put a sentence in your sanctions bill that all options are on the table like they have been for months, if not years.
So, yeah. Mr. President, to sort of end this colloquy, and I know Senator McCain and Senator Menendez would like to speak, I fully support every comment that's been made by a senator from Connecticut, the senator from South Carolina. I'm not associating myself with the comments by the senator from Kentucky that you just alluded to. And if you would, I'd love for you to insert that language into it regarding the fact that this is not authorization for the use of force. But I want to say that's not because I don't support exactly the sentiments that are being laid out here. I do. I just want us to continue. I want the Senate to be a part of any action that might take place. Hopefully it won't, but if we end up with kinetic activity there, I want us to be involved in that. So as a nation, we go forward if that occurs in a unified way and we don't end up with the same kind of thing we've had in the past where we end up having partisan disputes. I thank you very much, and with that I yield the floor.
Gentleman, yield for a question.
Yes, Senator McCain.
Senator from Arizona.
Isn't it true that the President of the United States said that it was, quote, unacceptable for the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon? I have a series of questions.
Yes.
So that means, doesn't that mean that the United States of America would reserve all options in case of an unacceptable situation where the Iranians continued, and we have seen no deviation from that path, towards the acquisition of a nuclear weapon?
The senator is correct. Here's what President Obama said. All options are on the table when it comes to the Iranian nuclear program. Israel, I have your back. Containment is not an option. I agree with the President. I think he's made the right statements, and I'm just trying to reinforce them.
So isn't it true that we're having this debate about whether this amendment or this legislation could be construed as an authorization or opening the door for military action, that the administration's policy is already very clear that it's unacceptable for Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and I'm sure that over time the three of us could talk for a long time about the implications for the entire region of Iran, not just the threat to Israel, but the entire region of an Iranian government, which is, quote, going to wipe Israel off the map, which then, of course, would force other nations in the region to develop nuclear weapons. Isn't it true that it has been a matter of national policy, both Republican and Democrat, that it is unacceptable? And that does not mean that we automatically would use military force, but it does mean that we would have to react to the development on the part of the Iranians of a nuclear weapon. So doesn't this resolution that we are considering is no different in any way, in fact, is less specific than what the President of the United States has said and what I believe most every member of the United States Senate is on record one way or the other saying that the development of a nuclear weapon by Iran would be an unacceptable situation.
Right. Well, let me just try to answer that. Senator Menendez and a group of us, Senator Lieberman and Casey and Hoven and myself, did the resolution in question today to echo the President's statement that we're not going to have containment as a policy. There's some people, even Republicans I might add, some very prominent Republicans, believe that you could contain a nuclear-armed Iran if you told them you ever used a weapon, we would wipe you off the face of the earth. President Clinton gave a very good answer to that situation. He said the biggest fear he has is not the Iranians would put a nuclear weapon on the top of a missile and hit Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. That's a concern. His biggest fear is they would share the technology with a terrorist organization. So that's why you can't ever let them get this capability. So the resolution is basically echoing the statement of the President, containment's not an option. And that 78 co-sponsors. Senator Paul has the right to object. He did. I don't think we can get there from here. I think he has a different view of what we're trying to do. Honestly held, good man, just honest differences of opinion. Back to the sanctions bill. Senator Menendez, you did a great job, as you always do on things like this. The reason that I found out about this and got so concerned is Section 603 is something that wasn't in the base bill. And again, it says, nothing in this act or the amendments made by this act should be construed as a declaration of war or an authorization of use of force against Iran and Syria. One, nothing in here has got anything to do with Syria, and I'm okay with saying that. I don't want this to be a declaration of war of authorization of use of force. I want it to be a good sanctions bill, but if you don't have the other means available to stop the Iranian program, as the President has indicated, all options on the table. That has to be said because we would be leaving a gap in our policy. So just Senator Menendez, Senator Reid, all I'm asking is that we insert a provision that basically echoes what the policy of this country is, all options on the table, not just sanctions. And we will get a lot of votes for this.
Finally, could I ask, because I know our friend Senator Menendez is going to speak, but this is not any change in American policy towards Iran, both Republican and Democrat.
Well, I think
that is that there is an existential threat to the State of Israel and other countries in the region, other Arab countries in the region, that would be posed if the Iranians continued on their development of nuclear weapons. So this resolution is an important statement on the part of the United States Senate and Congress, but to somehow say that this is a major change in policy of any kind obviously flies in the face of a record of this president and previous president as regards to this issue. And I also would like to thank the senator from New Jersey for his continued contributions to these national security issues.
And I would just close out and yield the floor to Senator Menendez. You're right about the resolution. We're not coming up with a new idea. We're just reinforcing an idea put on the table by our own president. We're not going to contain a nuclear-capable Iran as a policy. It's not a declaration of war. It's not authorization of force. It's restating a policy at a time when it may matter. Back to the sanctions bill.
And if there was a need for military action, it is the view of all of us that we would come back to the Congress of the United States before any such action were contemplated.
Well, here's my view about that. I think the President would be wise to include the Congress. I'm a conservative who thinks the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. I find it odd that our party for all these years have railed against the War Powers Act until President Obama's in office. All of a sudden, we're great champions of the War Powers Act. But what I would say is that it would be wise for the President to consult with the Congress and for us to be united. And if you do believe in the War Powers Act, he has to, within a period of time, to come back to get our approval to continue. Whatever the President needs to do to defend us against a nuclear-capable Iran, I think is best made by the Commander-in-Chief consulting with the Congress, but you can't have 535 Commander-in-Chiefs. And just back to the sanctions bill. The problem I have is that it's silent on a concept that we all agree on, and I don't want to create a document Tuesday, before the negotiations Tuesday, that doesn't include something beyond sanctions to change the Iranian behavior that we all want to avoid. And this says, it is a sense of the Congress that the goal of compelling Iran to abandon efforts to acquire nuclear weapon capability and other threatening activities can be effectively achieved through, it goes through 10 pages talking about sanctions, and not once does it mention the possibility of military force. And that's what I want to add, that concept. With that, I'll yield the floor, and I hope we can work this out. And Senator Menendez, you're a great guy. I'm sorry we're having this problem, but it's very important to me we get this part of it right. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I appreciate the comments of both my colleague from South Carolina and my colleague from Arizona. They're leaders in this regard in terms of the national defense. And if I ever had a case, I would want Senator Graham to argue it for me because he is a fine, fine lawyer, and I've seen that on the floor, and I've seen it in his role when he, as a reservist, goes and part of, as I understand it, the Judge Advocate General program, so he does a fantastic job. But let me make some observations here that I think are critically important. Number one is I share Senator Graham and Senator Lieberman's concern and the desire to have the Senate on record as saying that we do not and cannot accept an Iran that has nuclear power and nuclear weapons. That's why I signed on to their resolution. And I think their resolution moving exactly in tandem, parallel with the sanctions legislation that I played a significant role with the chairman of the Banking Committee, Chairman Johnson, and others to bring to the floor is incredibly important. But let me make some observations. First of all, in the committee itself, when it passed unanimously, all of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle had the opportunity to offer an amendment and/or language that would have done exactly what the senator wants, and no one on either side of the aisle sought to do it because the focus was on the jurisdiction of the committee, which is economic sanctions that have proven in their first iteration to begin to have real consequences to the Iranians, devalued the real by over 50%, creating challenges in their economy, closing the financial institutions they can deal with in the world, looking at their oil, having major discounts on their oil, finding it increasingly difficult to sell. And we have the opportunity to perfect that, to make it even more stronger, even more viable before they head into negotiations and think they can buy time. Now, it was silent when it came out of the Banking Committee, and yes, in the manager's amendment, there is that provision because, in fact, in order to deal with one of the objections of our colleague on the other side of the aisle, Senator Powell, provisions saying that this was not a direct military authorization was included so that we could ultimately find the opportunity to pass it on the floor with unanimous consent, the same unanimity that the Banking Committee had, the same unanimity we had when we passed the sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran. And that unanimity sends an incredibly strong and powerful message to the Iranians. So it was in the process of accommodating that Senator Reid talked about over the last 2 months to try to get us to a point that we could pass legislation that in the process of accommodating that language comes forward. The concern is ultimately taken care of by Senator Lieberman and Senator Graham's resolution. That, in fact, the President has said, as the Commander-in-Chief of the country, that a nuclear-armed Iran is not an option, that containment of a nuclear-powered Iran is not an option. This President has put all of the military assets that are necessary, that did not exist before in the Persian Gulf, to both respond to any incident or to initiate any action that he thinks may be necessary. And so, therefore, those actions, more than any words, have made it very clear to the Iranians that that is a real possibility if the national interest and security of the United States is ultimately challenged. And so I really think that insisting in the sanctions part of the legislation that has the full force and effect of law and real consequences to the Iranians in their economy, which is the most significant way that we undermine their march towards nuclear weapons, is important to move while you move independently the legislation that Senator Lieberman and Senator Graham have talked about, which is making the intentions or amplifying the intentions of the President crystal clear. But you should not hold hostage the sanctions legislation in order to accomplish a goal that should be taken care of by the Lieberman-Graham resolution. And you shouldn't hold it hostage when, in fact, you have a powerful tool to exercise before the next round of negotiations. The Iranians must know that we are one of purpose, and that oneness comes by passing the sanctions unanimously through this chamber and achieving ultimately their effects. So that's the only point of disagreement with us. Don't hold the sanctions legislation hostage. None of our colleagues sought to include that language, and the language that is included is in response to a colleague from the other side of the aisle in order to be able to move the legislation. So you can't have your cake and eat it too, but we do need to have our ability to move this sanction before the Senate adjourns this week, and that, I think, will meet our collective interests as a nation. There's only one piece of turf we should be fighting for, and that's the collective turf that is our country. And that is what we can do by passing the sanctions legislation. I hope that Senator Reid will have the opportunity to clear the way and to move it by unanimous consent, and in doing so, send a real powerful message on behalf of the Senate. With that, I yield the floor, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I want to ask consent that the senator from Delaware, Senator Coons, and I could have a colloquy for up to 15 minutes.
No objection.
Senator from Delaware is not yet on the floor, but I know that he's coming, so because I know other senators would like to speak at 2 o'clock, I'm going to go ahead with my remarks, and then when he comes, let him go ahead with his. Mr. President, each year approximately 50,000 foreign students receive advanced degrees from universities in this country in the areas of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We call that in shorthand STEM degrees, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Of those 50,000 students, at least 17,000 go home to other parts of the world. Mr. President, these are some of the brightest men and women in the world. They're attracted to the best universities in the world. I always say that our universities, our great research universities especially, are our secret weapons for job growth. Since World War II, many estimates by the National Academy of Sciences suggest that more than half of our new jobs have come from increases in technology. And it's very hard to think of any important increase, important new innovation in biology or in the sciences that's not had some sort of government-sponsored research over that time. So our research universities are job factories, and our advanced degree holders are the ones who come up with the great ideas. And as a former president of the University of Tennessee, which is a fine research university, I know that increasingly in the science, technology, engineering, and math programs in those universities, most of the students are from other countries. These students line up in India and compete, hoping they'll get a chance to come to the United States. They have done the same in China. They do the same everywhere in the world. And about 17,000 of those 50,000 who come from the advanced degrees go home each year. Senator Coons and I yesterday introduced a piece of legislation that would help those 17,000 students, and we hope more who may come, to come to the United States, get their advanced degrees in science, technology, engineering, and math, and then stay here and create jobs in our country instead of going home and creating them in other countries. Now, I'll have to admit there's a value to students who go home. I mean, it's probably our best foreign diplomacy to have someone come from another country, live here, learn our values, go home and explain those at home. But we want the next Google to be created here, not in China. And we want the brightest people in the world. If we're going to attract them here, provide an education for them, we want to give them every opportunity to come here. And today, we make them go home. We make them go home because of our immigration policy. So the legislation that Senator Coons and I introduced yesterday, and which now has the support already of at least two other senators, Senator Lugar and Senator Isaacson, who've asked to co-sponsor. It would, number one, create a new student visa for citizens of other nations who want to come here to pursue a master's or a doctor's degree in science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Number two, once they get that degree, the new visa would allow them to remain here for 12 months looking for a job. And three, once they're employed, the bill establishes a procedure to allow the students to change their immigration status and to receive a green card. And finally, these new green cards would not count toward any existing green card limit. This idea is not new. It has as much support outside of the Senate chamber as any idea I know about, from companies, from like Microsoft, who tell us that they have 2,600 jobs available that require a computer science degree that start at $104,000 a year. I mean, they'd like to have these students work here and create jobs for us. And we know from our own experience the importance of these green card holders. The Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee is one of our great, probably the greatest engineering laboratory in the world. Who runs it? Dr. Jeffrey Wadsworth ran it. He's now the CEO of Battelle. He had a green card from the United Kingdom. Dr. Tom Mason runs it now. He has a green card from Canada. Dr. Thomas Zachariah is the father of supercomputers. There he has a green card from India. So we want them here, not in India, not in the United Kingdom, not in Canada. So I greatly appreciate the leadership of Senator Coons of Delaware on this issue. He's worked hard on it. He's been a leader on it. And I only have one more thing to say about it before I step aside and let him talk about his ideas. In 2005, we began to work on something called the America Competes Act in this body. In 2007, we passed it. It was sponsored by the Democratic leader and the Republican leader. It had 35 Republican sponsors and 35 Democratic sponsors. It passed the House. It was reauthorized last year. We asked the best minds in our nation to tell us what would be the 20 things that we could do as a Congress to make sure that we are competitive in the future, that we can keep this high standard of living we've come to enjoy. And it's a very high standard of living. We have about 5% of all the people in the world. We have about 25% of all the wealth in the world that we produce each year. How can we keep doing that? They gave us these 20 ideas, and we passed many of them. It's one of the great successes of our Congress over the last several years working together. One piece of unfinished business from the America Competes Act of 2005 and 2007 was pin a green card on the foreign student who gets a graduate degree in science, math, technology, and engineering. The legislation that Senator Coons and I offered yesterday would do that. I greatly value his leadership and the way he's approached this, and I hope that we can work with our colleagues on both sides of the aisle to take this idea, turn it into a law, and give our country more of an opportunity to create new jobs as we move forward. Mr. President, I've already asked permission for the next 15 minutes that Senator Coons and I would be in a colloquy, and I'd like to defer to him for his comments at this time.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Alexander. I can't think, Mr. President, of a better person to partner with, to seek some advice.